We're very happy to do this little walkabout. We have 5 works of art, maybe 6, that we're going to talk about in sort of general ways. My role when I look at art is with the Pompidou is we work with their American collection. So their curatorial team lets us know where there are gaps in the collection, and we, using that information as well as other information about American artists that we have, acquire and donate works to the Pompidou that then live there and are part of their collection. So I tend to, at least at work, I'm very limited to American artists, and of course that makes me look at other artists, probably less than I should, but in a whole new, with wide eyes and lots of interest when I do. So we are looking at a couple of American artists, and mostly they're foreign though. Anyway, and over to Kate.
And Abase, we have to thank you as well for having us and including us as part of this program. And thank you all for being here. Abase already did a wonderful introduction, but I will just add, for what you're saying about filling in blanks, I'm a writer who's American but currently based in Zagreb in Croatia. And when you're talking about filling in blanks, a lot of these, and some of the artists we'll be talking about, are more artists who are working outside of maybe traditional structures of power and art and attention, and so some of their legacies are only becoming sort of known at this point. So we're actually going to start with one of those, I think. So maybe I'll let you take it there.
Our first artist is right up here on the left. Beverly Pepper is a sculptress and does a lot of land sort of installation works, and also then these sort of more totemic pieces that she does that are sort of freestanding. And she's, at this point, I think 95 years old. So she's an artist that I would say, because of her advanced age perhaps, people are really looking at her in a new way and with, I think, a greater appreciation than they had, although she's always been a successful working artist. What's interesting also here is that we're here in Italy, and her first group show and her first solo exhibition were in Italy, and she works in Italy and lives in Italy. So she has this long-standing relationship with Italy, which is nice. But just to sort of speak a little bit about these works, which are sort of very totemic, but you see, and I'm going to turn it over to Kate in just a minute, but there are these, very geometrical forms, but then these very organic forms also that are in direct opposition. And one of the things that Pepper talks about in a lot of the press, or that you'll see about her if you look, is that she believes all great art sort of exists with these, diametrically opposed, with this tension between sort of the organic and the geometric. And she thinks that you need to have opposites to create great work. So it's interesting when you look at these works that, of course, they rely so much on that, and also on their material.
In some ways, I mean, that was a really lovely introduction for me as well, because I know in some ways you know her work quite well, being based in California. One thing I did want to note also is the use of the material here, which she did a lot of sculpture in Corten steel, which this might be me inflecting my own reading on it. Coming up as an art historian in the States, Corten steel has a very specific association with male, with a machismo, I should say, not necessarily male, but with these works like Richard Serra, these big, strong works that are all about the material. And what she does with that same material, I think, is a really kind of, it's interesting to consider in the ways that she works with it too. And she wasn't shy about taking on these kinds of, what was seen at the time as maybe a mismatch of material or something like that.
One thing I know that's interesting about steel is that looked at something Beverly Pepper had been writing about, and she said, or an interview, I think, and she said, everything eventually becomes iron, everything. And our teardrops have iron in them. Everything will eventually turn into iron. And so in a funny way, even though these things have this sort of this permanence, they also refer to a passage of time that is so beyond anything we can comprehend. And I don't think that this is done lightly or by mistake. I think this is absolutely a reference to sort of eternity and to things that come from the ground and return, but also to the fact that she's sort of addressing these sort of larger issues with these things that appear to be very totemic, but really hint at so many other things, not just the sort of possible totemic relationships, but other things.
So we'll continue to the next gallery, P420, which some of you might know because it's based in Bologna. This is one of the galleries that has been working with an artist group that I worked with called Gorgona. And so I first kind of got to know the gallery's program through them. But the artist that I want to look at the booth now, actually when Eliza and I were talking about works we wanted to show, it kind of came together quite naturally that a lot of the artists that drew our eyes, basically at the fair, happened to be women, happened to be mixed generations, actually, I should say, because we have a few younger ones in there as well. And a 95-year-old. But the artist that I want to talk about here, and we'll have to kind of squeeze into the booth because there's not that much space in this, but is an artist named Irma Blanc. This work some of you might know because there was a presentation in the Venice Biennale that also included a similar body of work, but in a different format, where it was bound as a book and you could actually flip through it. But this, basically what she was doing, it's from 1975, I believe, but she was doing these experiments where she would lay tracing paper over different kinds of printed materials. So this is, you can see it's kind of a critical text, because you'll see the kind of where the headlines are and the chapters. But she would overlay the paper over these pages and make these very delicate sort of transcriptions, as if copying the language, but not actually the letters, and creates this kind of flow that you perceive as a form, and you kind of understand that it's a book, even though this is an abstracted language and an abstracted form of that. I don't know if we didn't get a chance to talk about this one in particular, so I wasn't sure if you wanted to add.
But I have to say, I'm not very familiar with this artist. So I was, when we were sort of talking about the different works, I mean, one thing, as Kate said, it was so interesting because without any preconceived theme or anything, we both happened to choose a number of works that were by women artists. And of course, then I was curious, is that because we're women that we were attracted to them? I mean, it was just happenstance. But it is interesting, that so much, I think, of women's work, or, and it's not exclusive to women, seems to focus on this idea of communication and of language, and sort of not just of broader themes, which is everybody, but specifically about language. So, Abase explained, I work at the Centre Pompidou Foundation, which is a sort of bad name for the American Friends of the Pompidou. And we support the Pompidou in any way that we can, and it's a group of Americans. It was set up the same year as the museum. So it was set up in 1977 by Dominique de Menil, and has always existed separately. And it's fun because we travel together as a group. The group loves to travel and learn. And so for me, it's, I think I've gone to like 9 different countries in the last 3 years on educational trips. And we just, we meet with artists, we do a lot. And for me, I worked at Sotheby's for 18 years before that. It's a completely different experience to really have a dedicated sort of, instead of helping a lot of different clients with their different goals and their different interests, it's really looking at a very narrow and specific thing. But of course, because it's American and I'm American, it sort of speaks to me. So this is a work by an artist named Bridget, one of the 2 artists who represented Austria this year in the Venice Biennale. And her work, which I think is it's very sculptural, it's very beautiful. But it's also, there's sort of a code to it. So if you look behind sort of the tubing, you'll see that there is this sort of pattern. There's the lines with the sort of dots and dashes, which is a reference. It is, in fact, Morse code. So Morse code was the first binary, communication, and Morse code relies on 2 things. It relies on speed of light, and it relies on a binary code. And that's exactly what this work does. It essentially, this is a date. And the date that's written out in Morse code is the day that Facebook was invented. when it went online at Harvard as the Facebook, and Mark Zuckerberg and his partner sort of put it up. And if you were to go and look at the original Facebook page, it really had unbelievable limitations. You couldn't chat, you could request friends, but you had to do that without using contacts. It was you could email people and they could accept. It was all incredibly sort of by today's standards, and this is only 12 years ago, incredibly antiquated by comparison. And I think that what she's doing, and she does do these sort of tombstones that mark different points in the history of the internet's history and the evolution of sort of communication within the internet. And I think what she's asking us to do is look at these dates, these sort of moments, and consider that, it seemed like such a leap forward in a funny way. I mean, it was this whole new way of communicating. And it's maybe not any different in some ways than Morse code, but it's also so evolutionary. It's changing every day, all the time, and it's sort of forcing you to recognize that these things are changeable. There are these tombstones, but at the same time, you're seeing yourself. So it's sort of a dialogue about your place in time and change within a time frame, and I always think her work is interesting. So,
but I had a question for you, since you just did a studio visit with her, yes? So how important, did she talk about how important it is that someone is able to decipher the work?
No. She didn't take, I assume that, if you read the title, it is delineated what is happening, what the date is. She's not making us guess, but once you know the code, I don't know Morse code. In a pinch, I'd have to look up how to SOS. So it's with this, she doesn't seem to mind that people don't know, but she does seem fixated on the idea of adding more and more layers to the possibilities within communicating with one another. And I think that's, as we were saying, at Irma Blanc's, it's women, we communicate, we're talkers, we gossip, we know what's going on. So it's interesting to me that these women seem interested in communicating. So.
Well, Eliza asked me to say a few words about myself to balance it out. I'm a writer. I used to run an art space in Moscow, and one of the artists we'll talk about later is a Russian artist. I have been writing for about 12 years and primarily writing on destinations where I don't live, which is a lot of negotiation. It's always that push and pull between deciding when it's useful to have an outsider's opinion and when you really need to do your research, to talk to someone who's from the scene. So I think I think that both kinds of criticism are important, that they work together too, because to be constantly on the outside and constantly seeing things as a tourist also changes the way that you experience work and art, which is why I'm happy to be in a place where I can do a little bit more research. But maybe, Eliza, do you want to start on talking about this one? Because this what you originally suggested.
Before we start, though, because you were born, I looked up your bio, and you were born in Nashville? Right, and now live in Croatia and also spent a lot of time in Russia. So, I think it's so interesting, and it speaks to sort of, I think, the world becoming smaller, but, that's a big change. So.
Yes, I wasn't quite prepared to talk about biography, but I guess it's part of it. It is a big change, but I think, like with the work we were just talking about, the way that networks have changed, the way communication has changed, the way that expectations and circulations of images have changed, it does change the conversation. That someone who was born in Nashville, Tennessee, which if you know it, it's not known for its art scene. So the fact that I'm now learning about artists in Seoul or Vilnius. There's a gallery from Vilnius across from us, or now Gateshead, which I visited for the first time 2 weeks ago, I guess. So yes, it's an interesting how we prioritize knowledge and voices, and that's a conversation a lot of people are having right now about what it means to be an expert when there's so much that we have available to us, when there's so much to know, so many references to catch.
This was a work that I just walked by, and I didn't know the artist. I didn't know anything about her work. And I stopped and I talked to Miles, and who told me about it. Is one of the two owners of the gallery, Miles Thurlow. It's funny. I've actually stopped at other workplace booths at other fairs. They have a very, I think, interesting program. So it was fun to learn about one of their artists that I didn't know about. So this is a woman named Jo Coop, who is a mid-career, although she's young. I mean, she's 42. And educated in a sort of traditional art background, but has a lot of other interests, sort of witchcraft and sort of the nature and science, and she's very trained in scientific sort of studies. And in this work, what she has done is taken these steel plate engravings and really dissected them with a scalpel.
Basically, Jo has cut out every single illustration so from every page of the book there's an illustration. She's cut every single illustration out with a scalpel and then collaged them together with tape, and then it forms a wreath, which is a funerary wreath, and then it's pinned to the backing with dissection pins. So it's really a kind of precarious and very delicate, extremely fragile piece of sculpture, really, I would say, that sort of talks about the idea of an organism, but also about death and symbolism, really.
You know, these engravings that were made sort of starting centuries ago, but became very popular also in the 19th century, were essentially done to kind of provide, specifics about these things as we were learning about the natural world, and immortalize them and sort of make them permanent. And so what's funny is she's taking these things that are really designed to sort of define what these things are and making them into this very ephemeral, very fragile, very delicate thing, which is, of course, in a lot of ways in today's world, we know what nature is. It's very fragile. So it sort of seeps back on itself in a very literal way. And also, she is taking different elements from sort of different groups, different pages, I think, and mixing them, which, given her interest in witchcraft and sort of the mixing different things and creating potions, and there's all sorts of different, and I don't know if you really look at what it is, if there's a distinct decision about, but I suspect so.
She's very knowledgeable about the specific, Latin names of the plants that she's using. But also, I think there's something very interesting about the idea. I mean, in this booth we're showing 3 women artists, all from the north of England. But I think there's something to do with the idea of women, and obviously in England, who develop knowledge about science or medicine, were persecuted and tried as witches and all that kind of stuff. So there's definitely a kind of a feminist position on that Jo is interested and informed by.
And again, some of you might notice that there is a repetition in these ideas of taking a body of knowledge, a body that is supposed to be about these flowers, providing information about these flowers, and transforming that into something that is more of it's a different kind of experience, a different kind of means of conveying that information. So I think it's interesting to see, as we were talking about the works that appealed to us, how those themes kind of came out quite naturally. Before we leave the booth, I would say it does make sense to get in closer to this and just see how it's attached, because the way that she overlaps these different cutouts, it's really flawless. It's really a beautiful piece in terms of its structure. But then we'll head over one block over to Katia Irigoy, which is a gallery that is, she's French, but it's based in Moscow. This artist is another artist who's working similarly mid-career. She was born in 1968. She's working with the materiality of her works as a way to kind of tweak information. I talked to the gallerist the other day, and she was saying that when she was thinking about what to bring to Vienna, she was really wanted to illustrate basically ways in which Russian artists are searching for new iconography and new symbols, basically, to represent what people think of as the Russian aesthetic heritage and legacy. Because at the moment, the images that circulate of what Russia is have been quite I'm sure you've seen them. There's a distinct break from things like the legacies of constructivism and the Russian avant-garde that artists in Moscow have been working with. So in particular, I wanted to draw attention to Marina Arendt, who are these collages. And basically, these are collages of famous constructivist buildings that are, you can see the Melnikov Dome, Melnikov, the Shukov Tower. These are sort of iconic for anyone who knows anything about this or has been to Moscow, this architecture. They're sort of the must-sees that people direct you to, even though when you actually get there, most of them are run down or in pretty poor condition, and so it's kind of a funny pull. But basically, when she's making these images using embroidery, but I mean, they look very sleek and beautiful, but when you get closer, you'll realize that in the embroidery, she's getting the colors based on pieces of newspaper, scraps of sort of the basest materials. And so it's sort of a commentary on how these sort of Soviet ideals were based on the sort of the everyday. And actually, Katya has joined us.
The artist loves to travel to Goa, and she produces it with the Indian workers. I mean, they're Indian men, they're very manual, so they do the very fine job that requires to produce a lovely piece. And so they use, it's just, accidentally that it has a paper. It's just to make it properly, they need to put the paper. So the real side is the reverse side. It's over here. And then it looks really like a drawing, very graphic, very firm, more like architectural drawing. And on this side, it's accidental, and the artist, she just loved it. And she said, let's show it both ways. And it makes it more like aquarelle looking thing, more artistic.
That's why it's good to have the gallerist here so that she can actually pick up the work and show you the other side. Did you want to add anything on our questions?
I just think it's interesting also that in a few of the works that we've looked at, there has been, I think, there's so many materials. I mean, I think one of the things that's been striking in the last several years is that you're looking at artists that have been working really outside of traditional sculpture and painting and drawing, and their work. Sheila Hicks is working with yarn, and this is embroidered, but there's paper sort of embedded into the and it's interesting that so many of the crafts have been sort of reinterpreted into use for art, and how they are expressive in ways that often painting might not capture this. A painting of an architectural building would not be the same. Yeah. So this is I think the use of material in this is incredibly sort of agile in trying to address her subject. So
I think the fact that it's a poor material that also, I think, has this warm touch, and it's never the new cloth. It's a founded cloth or been used cloth, and it has this, human life inside, and it makes it much, warm as an object. So sometimes people, they stop and they don't know what attracts them, really, and it's really the power of material.
With the two shows this summer, with Documenta and Venice, there was a number of works that seemed to be in this language at both shows. Was this a coincidence? Do you think there's a bigger focus now? And there were also male artists that worked with these materials, which was kind of a surprise, materials that are often associated with female artists.
I think in terms of that question, actually what we were just talking about reminded me of how much the focus on Venice, for those of you who have been to the Venice Biennale, Christian Massel's main project is quite steeped in craft and craft traditions. In some ways, I want to say that this is also about, with this expanded knowledge, with this expanded access to images, to information, that we are filling in the blanks. We are in a process of reconsidering the ways that we have framed aesthetics and aesthetic production. Just thinking about the men who are working on this work with Maria, what these handicrafts, these men who do this for their living, what they were thinking about making it in these designs, having it shown this way, working with her on it. There is work that needs to be done in the ways that we've structured our hierarchies within the art world. That said, I would also like to think some of it is also a pushback in the name of the experience of the artwork. When we're so flooded with digital images and the instantly available, just Google search this artist and you'll see these works. But the difference between seeing this work on your palm in your phone and standing up here and understanding that there's, not in this one, but the other one, there were bits of newspaper from India, or, it also has, it's just in English. But finding the way that these textures play, finding the way that when you were moving around the Bridget, how that changes that actual experience. I think that there's a broader emphasis now on how we position ourselves in terms of the physical and material.
And also making things personal. I mean, in sort of the ability to look at, Sheila Hicks, you go into her studio and there is yarn everywhere. You're like in a bird's nest. But she takes these things and makes these, and they have this, even on giant scale as they were in Venice, they have this handmade quality that I think maybe as a society we don't see as much anymore, and maybe we miss. And it is, you look at sort of the traditions of craft and quilting and knitting and all these needlework that have been sort of brought into art. And they are, as you said, women's, traditionally in sort of women's sort of work. And years and years ago, a woman I knew wrote a book called Anonymous Was a Woman. And it was specifically about works of art that were quilts or needlepoint objects, but incredibly sort of artistic and beautiful, but were done by anonymous artists because these were just women and they didn't sign their names. And it wasn't that long ago. So,
actually, that's perfect you brought that up, because when we were talking about doing our intro and we realized that the women the artists we picked all happened to be women, we were thinking about mentioning Linda Nochlin, who is an amazing American art critic who died last week. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with her. She wrote this one essay that really changed a way a lot of art history has been written and constructed since, where she was asking the question of why are there so few great women artists, basically, what we think of the great masters. And part of her project was looking into the histories, looking into the way things like craft were framed. Not to say that it's just an exclusively female, and I know that there actually were some artists here in the booth in the fair we were also tempted to include using craft, but I think it's an interesting moment to be having this conversation again. But
yeah, and we didn't mean to have it take on this like women rule kind of nature. But does anybody have any questions or thoughts about not just this work, but any of the works that we've looked at, or comments about the fair in general? Things that you please. What impressed? Does anybody have a thought about the curated sections? Did they impress you? Did you love them as much as I think we all loved them?
Do you each in your work, and do you make an effort to be aware of the diversity in languages and form? Do you make it part of your work to try to cover as much shows and give a diversity and include languages that are not? Do you in your work try to bring those artists in front of your board to look at and acquire? Does your institution have that flexibility?
Most of our decisions are driven by the curatorial team at the Pompidou, so not particularly. It's so interesting, though, to watch how they are very conscious of looking, I think, at so many different media and so many different sort of influences, and they are very broad. They look at, older artists that have, never really gotten their due. They look at young emerging artists. They look at everything, and I think they are incredibly, brilliant in the way that they sort of look at the world and try to incorporate as many different things into the collection as they can, not knowing, of course, that what we acquire or what they acquire in 2017 will mean in 20 years. So often it takes decades to really come to conclusions, but having all the pieces there allows you to let those decisions come, or those, and have the right elements to tell the story. So
I mean, I sort of touched on it earlier, and it will probably resound what you were just saying. But as a writer, and specifically coming from art history as a background, and only later curating, it is difficult to understand when it's your place. You know, it's a difficult balance right now. I think one of the questions that's been asked quite a bit earlier this year is these ideas of like who has the right to give voice to some of these traditions. As someone who is not familiar with this craft, with this kind of needlework, what does it mean when I'm writing about it? The kind of research that I mean, I'm sure even just walking around the fair, the projects that you've seen, they all require their own bodies of research at this point. There's so much going into these works that to be fluent in contemporary art is already not a possibility. Which is why I've kind of been choosing on these these moments of zooming in, having that personal and physical experience with the work. I will speak just institutionally for a second. I'm primarily affiliated with a magazine called Art Forum, which I've written for now for over a decade. And it's always a constant tension of figuring out what it means to call yourself international when there's so much going on at any given moment, and the sampling of international that is able to get in there is always just the very tiny tip. And so I do think there's a responsibility if we're going to talk about having this global art world where we see each other in fair after fair, where I can see Katja, who I've known now for years as well, who was one of the first people I met when I came to Moscow, because she was working with Gosha Stretsov and Zhora Lidichevsky. But the fact that we're coming from these different experiences and different backgrounds, I think it requires that awareness of your perspective and awareness of the limitations of your perspective as well when approaching some of these situations. So
I want to thank you both for coming, for giving this great talk, and to Artissima for making it possible. This was the last one, so you have to come back next year for more. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.